Awesome. Well, Elie, it's great to finally connect. I know you're 5 months into the job as Tinder CEO. And before that, I know you ran OkCupid as CEO for a little bit less than 2 years. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And why did you make the transition from from OkCupid over to Tinder?
I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's just an incredibly unique opportunity for exactly the reasons that were said, right? It's one of the most recognizable brands in the world. We sit at kind of this really special intersection of social culture, kind of this really unique combination of the world of technology, but also the world of culture brands I think that are actually more reminiscent of fashion and apparel. So it's a really, for somebody who loves to do what I love to do, it's a really special and unique experience.
Okay. Well, I just want to address the elephant in the room, that being Facebook. Earlier this week, Facebook made a big splash by announcing a new dating service, Facebook Dating. What are your thoughts on Facebook getting into the dating arena?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting and big question. I think starting at the top, right? We're actually not competitively focused. If you think about the genesis of Tinder actually enters the space broadly of connecting people to meet in real life, right? And there's people, there have been things like Match.com and OkCupid, which I just ran before it, but Tinder with a kind of a revolution and a kind of an interesting combination of product innovation, right? The swipe, obviously incredibly recognizable, double opt-in, and then a series of really important decisions around brand blew open the kind of broadly the category that's defined, right? So you have before Tinder, people who are under 25 don't use a dating app basically at all. It just was not done. To the extent that it was done a little bit on OkCupid. And fast forward, 5 years, and now it's kind of like the new norm. So I think it's kind of like an interesting backdrop of how do you get there. You get there by innovating. You don't get there by copying a competitor. There's nothing to copy. And so I think that's, for us, the highest level thing is we actually need to innovate and not copy competitors. And that's the challenge, right? The team has to be laser focused. We only think about one thing all day, every day. Facebook has lots of things to think about. We have the benefit of thinking about one thing all day, every day. And I think that at some level, competition is galvanizing, right? It makes you bring your best game. So I think that's kind of like the backdrop. Mm-hmm. I think more specifically, dating is a really, dating, hooking up, connecting, meeting up is a really interesting category. It's not a utility. We're not like Expedia for people. I think it's a really important idea. If we were a pure utility, right, then Match.com with its billions of dollars of advertising would have won. And that, of course, didn't happen, right? Tinder is today 10 times bigger than the next closest competitor. So there's something else right in there, and that's really critical. And what I would call that is ambiance.
Ambiance.
The ambiance of the environment of one of these experiences. And I have the benefit, kind of a unique benefit, of having now stewarded two, Tinder for a short while, OkCupid for a little bit of a longer while, and OkCupid at a really important and pivotal and complicated moment in its history where it was really on the downslide. And so ambiance is going to be tricky, right? I saw Colbert last night, and he's kind of picking on Facebook. And the core theme was when you use Facebook, there's a lot of context, right? There's a lot of ambiance. That ambiance, right, is really specific. It could be kids' pictures that you're seeing. It could be knowing about Cambridge Analytica. It could be all of the other stuff they do. And so they have an interesting set of baggage.
It was definitely an interesting moment for Facebook to launch a dating service, given the Cambridge Analytica crisis or scandal back in March. I definitely want to circle back to ambiance a little bit later, but I do want to touch a bit more on Facebook and its dating service. As a result of the announcement, I know that Match Group's stock, which technically owns Tinder, and of which IAC owns a majority voting and ownership of, Match's stock has dropped significantly since the Facebook announcement. Is that something investors are clearly concerned? Are you concerned?
I honestly don't think so. I think that there's two things, so without commenting on the stock price specifically, and honestly, the stock price will be what it will be, years down the road. If you want to listen to our earnings call, there's an earnings conversation from Match Group next week. I think it's not debatable that Tinder has been an amazing business in addition to being a cultural phenomenon and social phenomena. I think the kind of things that we'll have to see, right, is how do we rise to the occasion? I'm convinced we can do that. I think We'll have to understand and see, to what extent does all that ambiance, all that context weigh on people, and in what way, and how do they choose or not to use Facebook, specifically actually in the arena that they've said themselves they're going to play, which is what I would call serious dating, which is a much smaller part of the category, right? The dominant part of the category by size is where we play, which is what I would call like more casual.
Right.
So, and they're in a very competitive space, right? They've got Bumble in there, they've got OkCupid in there, they've got Match.com in there, so they're in a competitive space.
Right, and just to reiterate for the audience, when Facebook announced its dating service back, I say back, but literally on Tuesday, Mark Zuckerberg in his messaging was very, very clear. He said, Facebook dating is for serious, meaningful relationships, not for quote-unquote hookups. So that's where you're sort of differentiating Tinder, it sounds like. You're basically saying Tinder is a larger umbrella for dating. It's not just serious, meaningful relationships. It's for what you call more casual relationships as well.
Yeah, I think so. It's worth like taking a step back and like thinking about what happened with Tinder, right? Because that's, I think, actually frames all of this. Tinder, when it came on the scene, you did have things like Match.com and OkCupid that were already there. But they had never really gotten very big, right? They never blew open. The category today is vastly larger, primarily because the biggest constituent of people who are single, people under 25, 26, 27, 28, that's just the math, right, use an app and previously didn't. And so like that's the kind of exciting and interesting by size part of the market. And honestly, it's in some ways a place where it's a category of one. It's our category. Now, I think, what is that part? That part, to me, and I can relate personally, I'm part of this broad demographic trend where people get settled or married much later. I met my wife when I was 35 years of age.
Did you meet her on Tinder?
No, I didn't. I'm right before Tinder.
Okay.
And so and I, by the way, would not have used a dating app, right? Like, I'm actually a really good example of that. So that transition, which happened in a really short period of time, we go from a category that's kind of marginalized to one that feels very mainstream. And by, not just in the U.S., it's a global thing. Tinder is a global thing. So this, I think of this as like this journey of being single. It was my journey. I have personal lots of experiences, ups and downs, and it's a big adventure and a kind of a blank canvas of an experience. And that's really what Tinder did, is we like took that experience and we created an environment, an ambiance where that made sense. Some people use the word casual. People use hooking up a lot, right? He used it yesterday, Mark, or 2 days ago.
Right.
So, but they said specifically they're going to go after serious. We know what we're good at.
Yep.
We had a great roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months on Monday. That remains the case today, so I remain as excited as I was. Competition will make us better. Like we have to rise to the occasion.
Got it. So it sounds like you clearly know where Tinder stands as being very distinguished and separate from what Facebook's trying to doing, and a good chunk of what the competition's trying to doing. But are you concerned? I mean, Tinder and Facebook also have this kind of symbiotic relationship, right?
Yep.
Where you can build a profile based on access to Facebook user data. Are you concerned that that fire hose of data might somehow be stopped or squeezed or even just cinched because of what Facebook is doing with dating?
So I think this is really important in the context of Tinder, because kind of an important backdrop, right, is we don't have sitting at the table at Tinder a constituent that is, quite frankly, prevalent on a lot of today's apps and sites, right, which is advertisers. That's not a constituent that sits at our table. We make our money from a different business model, right? Effectively, all of our money comes to us from people who either, they buy features. It's a freemium business model, and they're buying features of some sort, either on a subscription basis or on an a la carte basis. It's a really important distinction. And so this idea of like data and user data, what we do have, and we have a variety of sources for it, is content that goes into your Tinder profile, right? Photos of yourself,
right.
A few words about yourself, maybe like where you went to school or how old you are or your name. And we actually have a bunch of different pathways into Tinder, and we will have more in the kind of months and quarters to come of that content that you tell the story of who you are to other people on Tinder. So that's, I think, a very important thing to think about. Facebook is one of those sources where people take information, photos primarily, from their Facebook profile and bring it to Tinder. But the word data is there's lots of nuances, and so I think we're very careful to distinguish. We don't have a lot of the data complexity We don't sell data. We don't have the people who really love data as advertisers. We don't have them as a big constituent at the table for us.
That sort of brought me into my next question is around, Facebook is obviously, data privacy is the big deal right now in Silicon Valley and beyond. I mean, how do you address data privacy with Tinder, and how do you assure users that their dating-related data is protected and shielded?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's probably two parts to it, right? One is that just by virtue of removing this whole complexity of having to build products oriented around advertisers, you take, I think, a lot of complexity out. We're aligned with our audience. Our members are paying us, and that's, I think, a really important idea, which is that we make money when our members have a better experience. That's literally all we think about day in, day out. It's a really big difference. Second thing, which I think is actually a backdrop not just for us, but for many, is GDPR, right? GDPR, which is the European Union's kind of privacy regulation. We've been, like many others, basically everybody has been kind of skating towards a late May compliance date, and so that's forced us to re-examine and re-look at all of it. I think we were very, very good before, and this puts that much more energy into it.
Got it. I want to change things up a little bit. How do you? Earlier we mentioned the competition, right? And you've alluded to. We've talked about Facebook. We've alluded to some of the other competition. How do you think? And you mentioned Tinder needs to sort of rise to the occasion, and sort of innovate to continue to separate itself from the rest of the pack. I mean, how do you innovate in a fast-moving space where updates roll out every 2 weeks, and the vast majority of your competition, frankly, has aped a lot of your mechanisms? I mean, how many apps are out there that let you swipe left and right?
Yeah.
Right? So how do you keep ahead of them?
Yeah, well, we refer to those apps as things that are eerily similar to Tinder, and I think the nature of being innovative is that you will very likely get followed, right? And so I don't know there's a magic formula. I think there's a bunch of things that go into it, right? One is talent. One is giving ourselves creative space. I think the core of it, though, comes from being laser focused on the experience of our members and the journey of being single, right? We have a really good understanding of that. That's a space we live and breathe. We don't do it as a sideshow. It's all we do. It's all we do every single day. And so it's two parts, right? It kind of comes back to a little bit the comparison to other people in the category, right? And not being a utility. We have both the software side, right? The technical, analytical, functional side, and we have this really, really complicated emotional side, which is, kind of ambiance, and we have to do both of those. And I would say that's actually our special sauce, is that we know those really well. If you look at product design at Tinder, you look at brand and marketing at Tinder, our ability to do that, we're world class at that, and also simultaneously building software for a scale audience. And I think it's a unique combination. It's not repeating the same comment again. It's not a utility. Mm-hmm. You can't just take the pixels, copy them, and get the same thing. And there's actually lots of history of that being true, right? If it weren't true, Match.com would rule the world. Bumble would feel identical to Tinder, which feels very different. It's very serious-oriented, very relationship-oriented, even though it's eerily similar to Tinder. Eerily similar.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this notion of serious versus casual. Again, as Zuckerberg said, Facebook dating is more about serious, meaningful relationships versus hookups. It seems like there is this stigma, right, around what we deem casual versus what we deem more serious.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that kind of criticism, especially when Vanity Fair wrote, I mean, I know you were not around, back when Vanity Fair wrote that investigative story about Tinder allegedly enabling this kind of more casual experience. How do you navigate that kind of criticism, which frankly endures to this day?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, this idea, hit it direct, the idea of hookup culture predates Tinder by arguably generations, right? What is the free love generation of the 1970s, if not that, right?
Without the app, without the smartphone.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the smartphone comes along. It didn't create hookup culture. I think, actually, let's reframe what, that word means, because I think that the visual of, what comes to mind is really important. If I say to you, hey, that's a trip to Europe, and you're going to go to Berlin, and you're going to go to Paris, and you're going to have some great experiences and meet new people, and you might hook up along the way, I think probably everybody in this room is that sounds like an adventure. That sounds like being 22, 23, 24, 25, and that's great. I think that is the blank canvas that so many people have. And look, tens of millions of monthly active users on Tinder are voting with their feet that this is an adventure, it's a blank canvas they want to fill. And so we don't shirk away from it. Hookups, hanging out, meeting up, talking, dating casually.
Right.
I actually think what that is like being 18 all the way to when you do get married and settle down. And there's obviously a mega trend there, which I'm a good example of, which is that this is happening later and later. And I think that grand adventure is a great one. Everybody should go on it.
Remind me again how many Tinder users there are now?
We don't break it out in any real detailed way. We have tens of millions of monthly active users, millions of subs. You can look at our kind of financial reporting to get all the specifics.
And are they the majority based in like the U.S. or versus international?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good one. Like we're actually a very global business. We're a big business in Western Europe. It kind of feels somewhat obvious. But what's I think less obvious and less well understood is that in parts of the world like India and South Korea, where social culture is evolving honestly quite rapidly, perhaps more rapidly than people realize, we're becoming a big thing. I think actually the thing that perhaps is a silver lining that people don't see with Facebook is Facebook will bring legitimacy and awareness to this feature set or this category in a way that I think ultimately probably benefits the whole category. Like they're set up, you do borrow some of the credibility and that they have. And so that'll be very interesting. We'll see how that plays out.
Do you feel like there was less credibility before? You mentioned credibility. Does that basically mean that, are you talking about skepticism, remaining skepticism around online dating or dating via apps? What do you mean by credibility?
Yeah, that. Think of this 5 years ago, right? This was a much smaller pool. The average 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old in the U.S. 6 years ago, which is like, a blink, right, was not going to use an app. And it was, you could use all kinds of interesting words in there. It was stigmatized or it was marginalized. And we've gone in a really short period of time in the U.S. And also Western Europe, although that's not exactly where the U.S. is, where the social culture has flipped, where it's the default that you do, not the default that you absolutely don't. So that's a huge deal. And so I think the category, when we look 5, 10 years down the road, like this is going to be a much bigger category, I think, and I think a lot of that's coming internationally, and you don't have to speculate, it's happening now.
Got it. Well, I want to take a very, very quick walk down memory lane, and I know, again, you've only been at Tinder for, was it 5 months now?
5 months, yeah.
5 months. That being said, when would you say, I imagine a lot of people in the audience here are familiar with Tinder, but when would you say Tinder had sort of reached a sort of public consciousness, had become a fixture in public consciousness?
I think it's because we sit at this really critical intersection of social culture, right? Like we are, there are apps that provide a service, right? If you want to find a place to live, you want to rent a house or buy a house, that's a utility and you use it every once in a while. That doesn't exist in social culture, right? Dating, sex, love, relationships. This is arguably the most important thing in most of our lives, and so it gets a lot of attention.
Well, my question was more around when.
Do you think when was it?
Do you think it was an incremental thing, or was there a moment when swiping left and right became the acceptable thing to do?
I think the one that's the story people like to tell is the Olympics, Sochi Olympics, right? That kind of blew it open. I think what that did was give a really good story.
And why the Sochi Olympics?
Well, again? I think, if you think about the Olympic Village, people were, think about young people all going to one place and they're going to meet a lot of new people, and Tinder was layered on top of that. By the way, Tinder is layered on top of a lot of different things like that. Festivals, Jazz Fest is here. You'll have a lot of people who come. You get off the plane in Vegas, right? You're going to meet new people on spring break. You're going to a ski town. So I think that's kind of like a fun, really exciting part of the story, and of course it combines the kind of spectacle of the Olympics.
Got it. And so I want to talk a bit more about, again, you came from OkCupid. I've used both, I'll be honest. Yeah. I've used OkCupid, I've used Tinder, I've used a bunch of other apps in the past, no longer. How would you say, and OkCupid has also really advanced forward with regards to its mobile app. How would you say OkCupid is different from Tinder?
Yeah, I think it's actually, I think very simple, and I think this goes back in I didn't create this, the team and I at OkCupid during my time there took the existing DNA, and the DNA was really around connections on shared sensibility, right? It's really all about, like, do we have things, kind of intellectual things in common, topical things in common, and I think we went and kind of had to update and revitalize that for a mobile app world, right? Remembering that OkCupid started as a site. It's kind of funny to think of that, right? But that's its era. So there was a lot of work. So I think that's actually very different, and it's not trying to capture the spirit of Tinder, which is I'll see where things go. It's much more, which is much lighter. There's a lot of things about Tinder which made it the breakthrough that it is. OkCupid is purposefully deeper, heavier, right? There's this whole act of, like, building a profile and answering the OkCupid questions, and it's just a very different thing. And I think it proves, again, this whole idea of it's not been a one-size-fits-all market to date. There's, like, no evidence of that. It's been all these different kind of ambiances, and some ambiances are bigger than others. There's one called Farmers Only, right? Like,
what does that mean? Farmers Only? Are they like geared towards farmers?
Farmers Only, yeah.
Agriculture-focused dating hookup app.
Yeah. I don't think the hookup part is a focus.
Oh, okay.
So, but then you have you have things like Hinge, right, which have become a modern day serious relationship app. So it's just we as people are multifaceted, and I think there's different ways of kind of thinking about how to connect.
Got it. Speaking to that, the other criticism that might be lobbed at Tinder is the idea of casual nature, the idea that Tinder perhaps enables, because it's so easy to connect with other people, that maybe it fosters this sort of shopping mentality. It's someone hotter, smarter, funnier, who makes more money, is literally a swipe away or geolocated around me on the SoulCycle bike. What would you say to those criticisms?
I think you take a big step back and say, like, first off, like, in the macro, is the world a better place because of Tinder? And, like, the world is way more diverse because of Tinder. There's, like, tons of evidence that the relationships are more diverse. On basically every dimension you can think of. I think it's a much more inclusive environment, which kind of ties into it.
How so inclusive?
Well, I think non-binary genders is an example. Racially inclusive, right? I mean, I think it's like in a myriad of ways, like radical inclusivity has been at the core of Tinder. Like, I think from very, very early on. So I think that's something to be really proud of. I do think, and I don't think it's specific actually to Tinder. I think it's more specifically of, like, our phones. These phones are with us. They're really powerful. They do all kinds of amazing things. They've made our life better. I don't think anybody in this room would give up their phone. Probably nobody, right? But yet you realize the power it has. And so do we control the tech, or does the tech control us? And there's a long history of this, right? In the early days, the tech tends to control us a little bit. The U.S., if you think about what happened with cars and how we built our cities, like, it's very much, in a sense, beholden to the car in the 1940s and 50s, right? Cheap cars, cheap gas. We go to the hinterlands. There's actually a massive kind of re-densifying that's happening now. That's us saying, wait, that didn't work exactly right. So I don't think that Tinder is in a unique frame here of, like, fear of missing out, bigger, better thing, right? Like
hashtag FOMO, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, what about then on the flip side of things, success stories? I mean, how many couples? Do you know how many couples have actually been matched up?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think we are. I think in all the studies I've seen, we are by far, by volume, the largest producer of marriages out there.
Wait, how many marriages?
I don't actually. It's a good question. I don't know the exact number, but a ton, right? I mean, like, tens. And I think that's because if you think about that single journey, right, and it has over that kind of 10, for some people 5, some people 10, some people 15 years. For me, I guess it was 17 years, right? That single journey, that adventure, that for many people, not all, at the end of that road, right, is a connected, serious relationship. Whether you choose for it to be after a year, or you say, hey, I want my adventure to be 7 or 8 or 10 or 17 years, right? No judgment, right? That's great. But for many people, the end goal is, hey, settle down, sure. And it happens a lot.
Got it. Well, what else can we expect from Tinder, throughout the year? How will Tinder be innovating and expanding and growing?
Yeah, I mean, without getting ahead of, like, our next, year and a half worth of product roadmap, I think it's safe to say, and I think the team would say as well, despite all of the amazing innovations we've had over a very short life, The roadmap today is more exciting, I think, than it's ever been. I would say one of the core themes is that we're going to broaden the part of that journey we play in, right? That journey is 5, 10, 15 years, and so there's a lot of, in a sense, jobs that our members want us to do for them, want the product to do for them, want the brand to do for them emotionally, and so we're going to broaden that.
Experiences around, like dating experiences, for example, or
yeah, lots of things related. I want to be careful about how far I go down this path, but okay. Things related to different ways in which you connect in the real world. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so
more to come.
More to come. All right then. So, what would be the last piece of advice that you would impart upon our singles in the audience who may be swiping left and right on Tinder?
I think the core piece, right, is like I think that if you think about the genesis of Tinder, right, the genesis of Tinder is that through this kind of magical recipe, right, which had breakthroughs in product design, what I would say breakthroughs in emotional design, breakthroughs in how we thought about the brand and who the product category was for. I think we kind of excuse the flowery language, we took a distillation of this journey of being single and where will it go, I'll see where it goes attitude, which I think is a really great one, and very different, by the way, than showing up to a marriage app with I want to get married, right? It's a very different frame of mind you join Tinder with, right? And
what kind of feedback do you get from Tinder users? Well, what are they asking for that maybe, either things that they're liking or gravitating to using the most, or maybe they want more of?
I think that we see all ways to find other people in different situations. Let's put it that way. I'm getting off the plane in Vegas. How do I solve for that?
How so? I'm getting off the plane in Vegas. I want to meet someone, connect with someone. Take me from point A to point B?
I open, better example. I go to Carnival in Brazil. I'm there with a group of friends. I want to meet other people. We're trying to make our social life in this real world experience better. People today, a lot of them open up Tinder. And so the question is, how do we adapt to experiences and examples like that?
Got it. I want to change gears a little bit, as we wind down in our final minutes. I want to talk about what is Tinder culture like? I think from an external perspective, people have this idea that Tinder is a very fun, freewheeling sort of environment. What is it actually like inside Tinder?
Lots and lots of hard work. I think that one of the you'll I think people heads down. I think it's interesting. I was coming from a business, OkCupid, right, which had its own very wonderful and unique organizational culture.
How are they similar? Are they different, the two?
They're actually in some ways more similar than I was expecting. They're both a little bit nerdy. They're very, very focused on to make it look simple, to make it feel elegant and simple and beautiful takes an immense amount of work. That's not just magically happening. And that's true in design, it's true in marketing, it's true in brand.
Is the Tinder culture internally younger than OkCupid?
Very similar. Okay. Yeah, very, very similar.
And how do you approach innovation internally? How do you motivate the troops? Because there are how many employees now at Tinder?
North of 300 employees.
North of 300. Most of them probably...
30 of them. We had 30 employees, 3 years ago. So
it's quick growth.
Very
quick,
fast
rapid growth. Yeah. And the majority of them are in West Hollywood in Los Angeles.
Yeah, we have kind of, the majority in West Hollywood. We have a very important office in Palo Alto.
Okay, got it. What's in Palo Alto versus...
Palo Alto is primarily product management and engineering.
Yeah.
And in West Hollywood, it's everything.
Got it. So if Tinder and OkCupid as well, to a large extent, were both about, this tech vertical and then this cultural ambiance vertical, which you mentioned, then internally, talk to me about how you as a leader, as a CEO, manage that group.
I think I don't know there's an easy answer to that. I think we have values that stretch across functions, right? They're not functional values as an organization. Things like humility and constantly learning, right? I think those are really foundational and important, like the idea that we're never done innovating, we can always learn from others. And that can be true and is true in product design, and it's true in our marketing group, and it's true in engineering. And so those are cultural values of our internal org, which are super important to me and to the team. And so those are examples that cut across.
Do you I use the word dog food, and by dog food I mean, do you encourage or mandate that your own employees actually use Tinder, single or not?
Yes, definitely. Yeah,
do they also,
I use Tinder.
Interesting. And do they also use do you encourage them to also use other apps like Bumble, The League, and so forth?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, look, if you imagine you design cars for a living, a personal passion of mine, you'd go test every single car out there. I think the challenge in that, right, is to not become competitor focused. It's a huge trap, right? You can become inspired, you can raise your game, you can learn, but if you start to I'm just going to copy them, you end up in a very bad place.
Well, I mentioned there are some companies who shall remain nameless out there, probably older publicly traded companies, that do not encourage their employees to look at the competition internally. God forbid you should actually dog food their stuff.
Yeah, it's not a view that I have. I think that if you're thinking about the idea of keeping your mind a clean slate so that it can innovate and not get in they did it, therefore we have to do it. I think that's an important idea, and it is a trap. It's a trap that you don't want to fall into. But yeah, I think the idea of not look. When Facebook's product, we have only seen mocks of Facebook's product. When it comes out, we'll spend a few hours. We'll get to know what it feels like. The critical part, going back to one of your earlier questions, right, is there's going to be two parts. There's going to be and there's going to be the emotional, the ambiance of what that is, and dissecting what that is, trying to understand what does this thing, for lack of a better sense, feel like, is not as easy as just breaking it apart and saying, well, this button is here and this button is here and so on, right?
It's what are the emotions it evinces, or what do I feel when I actually use this experience?
Yeah, I think Colbert did a great thing last night where he spoofed two people on a date where they had met from Facebook, and I think he actually does a really good job of his viewpoint, not mine. I don't have to use the product, so I don't know. Of what the ambiance of that place will be like. And
to remind our audience, the ambiance being everything is allegedly on Facebook. There's less mystery to our dates. I can find my date and go to their Facebook profile and see that in 2008 they bought a dog. In 2010 they bought a new car. So it takes a little bit of the mystery out of it, perhaps.
Yeah, and I just tabbed over from looking at kids' pictures. So I think it's just the thing I think about a lot, right, is that we spend time capturing that essence, making the product great, and ultimately what we're trying to do is capture a space in people's heads, right? Not physical space on the home screen of their of the phone. Yeah, sure, that too, but they have to feel like they want to come to us. And I think what you've seen about our category and a variety of categories is people make those choices based on the products they like the best, and so our challenge is to make the very best product. I think we're world-class at that, as has been evidenced now by the past 5 years. Every reason to believe we'll be world-class at it in the next 5.
Great. Well, best of luck, Elie. Thanks again for your time and insight this afternoon in New Orleans. We appreciate it.